On February 2nd, 2008, Lindsay Buziak put on her heels, gathered her paperwork, and drove to what should have been a routine house showing. It was late afternoon in Saanich, British Columbia. The kind of neighborhood where lawns are trimmed, driveways are empty, and nothing violent ever seems to happen. The couple she was meeting sounded serious. They said they had just moved to Canada, they were looking for something upscale, and they were ready to buy immediately. For a 24-year-old real estate agent building her career, that kind of client could mean everything. But when she spoke to the woman on the phone, something didn't sit right. The accent felt strange. The urgency felt forced. The request for privacy felt deliberate. Still, she agreed to the showing. At 5:30 p.m., she unlocked the front door of a $1 million home on De Sosa Place. A well-dressed man and woman walked up the driveway. They greeted her calmly, they stepped inside, and within minutes, Lindsay Buziak was stabbed to death in an empty house. In the middle of the day, in one of the so-called safest communities in Canada. The couple who booked the viewing were never identified. The phone they used disappeared. This wasn't the kind of violence born from impulse. It felt measured, planned, like the ending had already been decided long before she had unlocked that door. The only question is, who arranged it? Tonight, we're gonna walk through every known detail of this case. The timeline, the phone records, the inconsistencies, the theories people still argue about. And I'll even tell you exactly where I land after digging into everything I could find. Because the more you look into this case, the less it feels like a mystery. And the more it feels like someone got away with something. So, grab a light and let's step into the dark together. In early 2008, Lindsay Buziak was doing what a lot of young professionals do, trying to prove herself. She had recently joined the real estate industry in Victoria, British Columbia. It wasn't easy, it was competitive, reputation-based, and success doesn't happen overnight. You earn it one showing at a time. She was ambitious, organized, careful about how she presented herself, the kind of person who showed up early and stayed prepared. So when the phone rang and a woman inquired about an upscale property, Lindsay listened. The caller said her and her husband had recently arrived in Canada. They were looking for something high-end, close to around $1 million, and they were ready to buy quickly. That alone would grab any young agent's attention. But the conversation wasn't typical. The woman's accent caught Lindsay off guard. Later, she would describe it as possibly Mexican or Spanish, but something about it felt unnatural, almost exaggerated. The caller avoided giving any clear personal details. She wouldn't say exactly where they were staying. She seemed oddly focused on privacy, asking questions about whether neighbors would see them entering the home. That's not how most luxury buyers behave. Now, don't get me wrong, I know nothing about real estate agencies, but I know that they usually ask about square footage, layout, property taxes, views on the house, whereas this caller, they seemed more concerned about being unseen. Lindsay hung up with a strange feeling. Not a panicked feeling, not a feeling of fear, just that quiet internal nudge that something isn't sitting properly. And if anybody knows anything about gut feelings, you should always listen to it. She did mention it, she didn't just brush it off. And here's a part that makes this case even more chilling. She trusted that instinct enough to make a small adjustment. On February 2nd, when she drove to 1702 De Sosa Place for the showing, she asked her boyfriend, Jason Zalio, to come with her. Not not to walk through the house, not to stand beside her during the showing, just to wait nearby, just in case. And that decision tells you something. It tells you that she sensed something. At around 5:30 p.m., Lindsay arrived at the property, a modern, upscale home in a quiet cul-de-sac in Saanich. Jason parked down the street. He watched her step out of the car, professional, composed, focused. A few minutes later, a man and a woman approached the house. They were well-dressed, clean-cut, calm, nothing frantic, nothing suspicious on the surface. They walked up the driveway, and Lindsay greeted them. Then, the three of them stepped inside. Jason remained outside. Now, I couldn't find anything if Jason had seen the faces of the two people that walked up to the house, but from everything that I've read and seen, it doesn't seem like he did, because he describes it as just feeling normal. Then, minutes passed, and the house stayed quiet. From the street, everything looked normal. The house sat quietly in a fading afternoon light, its windows reflecting the calm of the cul-de-sac. Nothing about it suggested urgency. Nothing suggested violence. Jason stayed in his car at first. Luxury showings can take time. Buyers wander slowly. They ask questions. They open closets. They picture themselves living there. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and at some point, that quiet stopped feeling ordinary. And it wasn't that too much time had passed, it was that nothing seemed to be happening at all. No movement behind the windows, no one stepping outside to take a call, no sublet signs of life inside, just stillness. So Jason tried to call Lindsay. It rang, but there was no answer. So he waited a moment and called again, and still nothing. That uneasy feeling that she had mentioned earlier, the one that she fully couldn't explain, now felt louder. He stepped out of his car and walked towards the front door. He knocked, and there was silence. He tried the handle, locked. So he moved around the exterior of the house, scanning the windows, trying to catch even the smallest movement inside. Like maybe they just didn't hear him, but nothing. That was the moment that waiting stopped feeling reasonable. So Jason called his mother. When he told her something didn't feel right, she didn't brush it off. Within minutes, she and a family friend were there with him. The front door was still locked. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no chaos spilling outward. Using a key that his mother had for the listing, they were able to enter the house. As soon as they stepped inside, the air felt wrong. Not chaotic, not super loud, just heavy. And unfortunately, this is where and when they found Lindsay. She had been stabbed multiple times. It was immediate and unmistakable. This was not an accident, not a robbery gone wrong, not something spontaneous. Emergency services were called. Police arrived and secured the scene. As investigators began accessing the home, certain details stood out quickly, like there not being any forced entry, nothing appeared to be stolen, the house wasn't ransacked, and the two people who had walked in with her, the well-dressed couple who had booked the showing, were completely gone. There was no confirmed vehicle identity speeding away, no neighbors reporting any panic. They had entered calmly, and somehow they had left just as quietly. In less than 20 minutes, a routine Saturday appointment had turned into a homicide investigation, and whoever had arranged that meeting vanished without a trace. Now that we know how it ended, let's go back to the phone call. Picture Lindsay standing wherever she was that day, maybe at home, maybe between appointments, answering what sounded like an opportunity. A woman's voice on the other end, polite, calm, and interested in something expensive. She said she and her husband had just arrived in Canada, that they were ready to buy quickly, and that money wasn't an issue. For a young agent building momentum, that that kind of call matters. But when the conversation ended, Lindsay didn't feel excited. She felt unsettled. And later, she would try to explain why. The accent, she described it as possibly Mexican, maybe Spanish. But she couldn't place it exactly. Something about it felt exaggerated, almost as if it was being worn instead of being spoken naturally. And then there was the focus on privacy. The caller didn't spend much time asking about square footage or layout. Instead, she asked whether the neighbors could see them, whether the showing could be discreet, whether they could avoid attention. That's kind of an unusual concern when you're about to purchase $1 million home. Not saying people don't like their privacy, it felt weird. And at the time, those details were just odd. Now, knowing how it ended, they feel deliberate. Also, the number used to contact Lindsay wasn't tied to a long-standing client. It was tied to a prepaid phone, and it was only activated shortly before the showing. Registered under false information. It contacted Lindsay, and after February 2nd, it went silent. No ongoing activity. No meaningful trail. It literally existed long enough to arrange a meeting, and then it just disappeared. To me, that's not really how serious buyers would behave. That's how someone behaves when they don't want to leave a name behind. And as investigators began tracing the call, its activation, its limited usage, its timing, the idea of this being random started to fade. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. Someone chose that house, someone chose that date, and someone made sure the first step of that plan couldn't be traced back. The phone call wasn't just how the showing was arranged, it was how the setup began. At first, the prepaid phone looked like a clean break. A number that appeared out of nowhere, activated shortly before the showing, registered under false information, used briefly, then abandoned. On paper, it looked like someone had covered their tracks. But phones, even disposable ones, don't move invisibly. Every time they connect to a tower, they leave behind a whisper of where they've been. And when investigators began mapping that whisper, something stood out. The phone wasn't activated in another province, it hadn't traveled in from across the country, and it wasn't bouncing in between unfamiliar cities. It was all local. The towers it connected to weren't random stretches of a highway. They were in areas that Lindsay knew. Areas connected to her daily life. And that's when the tone of the case began to shift. Because if this was a crime committed by strangers passing through, the digital trail should have looked scattered. Instead, it hoovered closely, close enough to make people uncomfortable. It suggested being familiar with the city, with the neighborhood, possibly with her. Investigators later confirmed that the phone had limited activity, almost no life outside of arranging that one appointment. It behaved less like a person's phone and more like a tool, turned on, used with purpose, and then discarded. And that changes the feeling of this case, because when violence is random, it feels chaotic. But when someone carefully selects a property, carefully selects a time, it feels constructed. And construction takes knowledge. Knowledge of how real estate works, knowledge of timing, knowledge of how to isolate someone without raising suspicion. The deeper authorities looked into the movement of that phone, the harder it became to imagine two strangers simply wandering into town and orchestrating something this precise. So the more plausible possibility was that whoever set this up wasn't far removed from Lindsay's world at all. And that's where this case stops feeling like a mystery and starts feeling like something much more personal. When something feels random, people search outward. When something feels targeted, they start looking closer. In the days after Lindsay's death, the city reeled. A daylight murder, a quiet neighborhood, a young professional just starting her life. None of it fit. And as more details became public, the prepaid phone, the careful planning, the limited digital trail, the questions began to shift. If this wasn't random, then why her? And that's where things get complicated. Lindsay wasn't living in isolation. She had a social circle, a professional network, relationships, people who knew her routines, people who understood how real estate showings work. And the house that was chosen wasn't random either. It was high-end, private, empty, perfectly suited for what happened inside. Online, theories began to form almost immediately, as they usually do. Some believed it had to be a professional hit, too clean, too calculated. Others even argued it felt personal, too specific to be random violence. There were whispers about connections, whispers about jealousy, whispers about the possibility that someone close to her may have known more than they admitted. And to be clear, no one has ever been charged in the connection with Lindsay's murder. No one has been publicly named by police as a suspect. But when a case remains unsolved for years, speculation fills that silence. And the silence in this case has been long. Her father, Jeff, has been one of the loudest voices refusing to let that silence settle. He has openly criticized aspects of the investigation. He has questioned decisions. He has pushed for answers long after media coverage faded. Because from his perspective, this wasn't just an unsolved murder. It was a failure to bring someone to account. And when you look at the details, the phone activated locally, the careful timing, the lack of forced entry, and the quick disappearance, it's hard not to feel that someone out there knows more than they've ever said. Maybe not a stranger, maybe not someone passing through, maybe someone who understood exactly how to make a showing look routine. And that possibility is what keeps this case alive, not just because it's unsolved, but because it feels unfinished. And when a case feels unfinished, it lingers. It lingers in communities, it lingers in families, and it lingers in that uncomfortable space between what we know and what someone is choosing not to say. When you strip this case down to the bones, a few things become hard to ignore. This wasn't chaotic, it wasn't impulsive, and it wasn't sloppy. Someone arranged a private showing at a vacant luxury home. They used a prepaid phone activated shortly before the meeting. They provided false information. They focused on privacy. They arrived calm. They left without drawing any attention. And they even locked the door behind them. That's not randomness, that's intention. Now, there are a few broad possibilities people tend to land on. One is the idea of a professional hit. Hired killers, clean execution, no emotional motive. It explains the planning. It explains the burner phone. And well, it explains the silence afterwards. But that theory raises a harder question. Why? What would justify that level of organization? The other possibility is something more professional. Not emotional in the moment, but deliberate. Someone who understood exactly how her world worked. Someone who knew how real estate showings operated. Someone who knew that a luxury property means privacy by default. And someone who knew how to isolate her without raising suspicion. That doesn't require outsider. It just requires access. It requires knowledge, and knowledge usually comes from proximity. Now, to be clear, no one has ever been charged. No one has been publicly named by police as responsible. Speculation online is just that, speculation. But when you look at the phone being activated locally, when you consider how precisely the meeting was arranged, when you remember that Lindsay herself felt uneasy before walking into that house, it becomes harder to believe that this was random. I don't think that it was impulsive, and I don't think it was the work of strangers passing through town. The structure of it, the control, the calculated nature of the contact, it suggests someone who understood her world, someone who knew exactly how to make that meeting look ordinary. And that's what makes this one of Canada's most chilling unsolved murders. Not just because it remains unsolved, because it feels like someone out there knows exactly what happened, and they've been silent for over 15 years. It's easy in cases like this to focus on the mystery, the phone, tone, the timing, the theories. But before any of that, there was a 24-year-old woman building her life. Lindsay Buziak wasn't a headline. She was someone's daughter, someone's partner, someone who had plans beyond a Saturday showing in February. She was ambitious, she was careful, and by all accounts, she even trusted her instincts. She felt that something wasn't right. She just walked into that house anyway, because it was her job. More than 15 years later, that house is just another address. The cul-de-sac is still quiet. People drive past it without knowing what happened inside. But for her family, especially her father, the quiet never settled. He has continued pushing for answers long after cameras stopped showing up. He has questioned the investigation. He has refused to let the case fade into background noise. Because for him, this isn't an unsolved mystery. It's really an unfinished sentence. And that's what lingers. Not just the brutality, not just the planning, but the idea that something so ordinary, a scheduled appointment, a routine showing, could be used as a weapon. That this didn't require chaos, it required knowledge. It suggests someone who understood exactly how her world worked. Someone who knew how real estate operates. Someone who knew how to create privacy without raising suspicion. Really, someone who knew how to make it look normal. And well, turn that understanding against her. And somewhere out there, someone knows exactly how that day was arranged. So, if you have information related to Lindsay Buziak's case, even something that feels small, it can be submitted directly to the Saanich Police Department, or anonymously through Greater Victoria Crime Stoppers. After all this time, even the smallest detail could matter. Because for Lindsay's family, this isn't just a mystery, it's a fight that never stopped. If cases like this matter to you, if you want these stories told carefully and thoughtfully, without turning them into spectacles, you're welcome to stay here. There are a ton more that we're gonna walk through together. Until there are answers, the questions remain. And sometimes the most unsettling part of the case isn't what we know. It's what someone chose to keep hidden. And as always, stay curious, stay brave, stay spooky. See you next time.